about that. And then after the last Sunday in February, we're going to do a wrap-up session here in Sunday school time. So that's where we're going. Now, inadvertently, my iPad updated while I came here, and so give me a minute or two, and don't put me up yet. There's the one I want. There we go. Whenever you're ready, then I'm ready. So last weekend, we talked about the Schleitheim Confession of Faith, the Anabaptist vision, and some of the big differences in how you thought about life. So I suggested that when it comes to discovering where does ultimate truth come from, where do you find truth in itself? And what should be at the center? And Narita reminded me of a diagram I've used in the past that I should use. Let's think about a circle and say, what should we study? And at the very heart of the circle is the essence of what we should study. Then there's these concentric rings that go out. There might be like that. And for at least in this time period, in the Reformation, this time period, the Catholic Church would have said that tradition and the sacred traditions and the Bible belong in the center. The Protestant reformers struggled to know what to say that should be at the center, but many of them ended up espousing something called sola scriptura, the scriptures alone, and they are in the center. Early Anabaptism said, hey, that's not me, is it? No. I look up and there's a guy looking over my shoulder. That's a little scary. So the sola scriptura, the Anabaptists came to this idea that Christ should be at the center of that, the living Jesus. And it makes a... Try reconnecting? Let me try this. There we go. Thank you. The early Anabaptists and the Anabaptism has always said that at the center of everything is a living Jesus, a resurrected Jesus. And you can't understand the scriptures if you don't know the living Jesus. And so at the center is Jesus, and the concentric ring around that are the scriptures. Now, this does not mean we have a low view of Scripture. It actually means we have a high view of Scripture. If you make Scripture itself the center, then you have to resort to figuring out what the Greek word... And so people who aren't trained in biblical languages and those kinds of things can't understand it. And the early Anabaptists would have said, no, everyone has the opportunity to understand Scriptures if they have the living Word inside you. And there is a big difference between how you live out your life, if this is the center or this is the center. Now, did they wrestle with things that, yeah, for instance, Felix Mons suggested you should not sing during church. Because if you sing during church, there is no specific command in Scripture that says you should sing during church, therefore you should not. Or it was Conrad Grebel or Felix Mons, one of the two. And so they wrestle with how do you interpret Scripture. But it's all built around how do I follow Jesus, ultimately. So what Protestantism ends up saying is it takes a trained theologian to truly understand truth. And the Catholics, and there's differences in that. The Protestants would have said there are 5 solos led by sola scriptura and then sola Christus. The Catholics said tradition and the Scriptures are hand in hand and they're there. And then through the hierarchy, through the priest. Now, that's official Catholic dogma, says that's how you understand and live out truth. Now, let's just look at a few of those other rings outside of that. I think there are other rings outside that we can learn from. One of them is nature. We can learn from nature. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, and learn of her ways. Now, is nature at the center or in the ring around Jesus? No, it isn't. It's outside of that. And so you have to interpret everything through these eyes outward. And I would even argue that out here is things like art, the outer ring, and architecture. You learn something about the nature and character of God when you look at good art. So, but it's not where we base any belief on. Belief is based on Jesus and the Scriptures. So I just want to return to that and say, and because of their focus on living out the gospel, you live it out. It's meant to be lived out on the street. It's a figurative in your lives every day of your life after you choose to follow Jesus. And they would have said you should only baptize people who know what it means to truly follow Jesus. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the spread of Anabaptism again. By the 1600s, and I should have brought a pointer along. Maybe I can use my, right here. But it begins here in Zurich. This is where, no, it doesn't show up on there. Zurich is down here. This is the Swiss Confederation down here. The first baptisms are held in 1525 in Zurich. That's the Rhine River, that line that flows north through Strasbourg and Worms. By the way, the W in German is pronounced B, with the V sound. So it's not diet of worms. There's a famous meeting held there, and it's spelled D-I-E-T, diet of worms. My students love that. Actually, you pronounce that word when it is. It's not pronounced diet when it's a meeting. It's diet of worms. So that's the Rhine River that flows, and the natural travel routes go up that way towards Amsterdam. And by 1530s, there's a large contingent of Anabaptists in that purple shaded area around Munster. We talked about Munster. It also spreads east. Nickelsburg. I told you about the Osborne hymns that are in the Passau prison, that are written out of the Passau prison. By the way, I started this series at Berlin Mennonite this last Wednesday night. I'll do 6 Wednesday nights there. And if I repeat myself, it's because I'm doing it too many places. And I'm doing it this weekend at their church, and so I have to remember what I said here. But I want to talk about some further spread. See all the way up there in the top right, Danzig, or Gdańsk, that's in modern-day Poland. And a small group of Dutch Mennonites moved there, and this is a swampy area. It's called the Vistula Delta, and they settled there. And they're because in Holland they're used to dikes, moving the water out. So they settle there, and so they do the same things there. They begin to move the water out of the swampy area, and they develop farmlands there, and it prospers. And then a little later, it's called Prussia in this time period. It's modern-day Poland. A little later, they had a leader, and he had a 6-foot rule. He had this cavalry, a horse cavalry, like an army unit, and he only wanted soldiers in this cavalry who were 6 foot or taller. And these are, some way, the genetics of this particular group of Dutch Mennonites had genetics for height. And he saw all these young men that are 6 foot and taller. I would not qualify for the 6-foot horse cavalry, okay? But, imposing large men is what he wanted. And he wanted their boys. Now, they had been promised freedom from military exemption. Wherever these Anabaptists move, that's one of the first things when they begin to move into this uneasy alliance as it develops by the 1600s. Last martyrs are in 1614. Now, it is still illegal to be an Anabaptist after this. In many places, it's still illegal, but what happens instead of being put to death, so one of the last martyrs is a man named Hans Landis, an old man. And at his execution, it so turned the public against what the state was doing against these Anabaptists that it actually brought people to the Anabaptist faith. And so they decided to stop killing them. And when instead of killing them, they would banish them, or they would simply sell the men to be galley slaves in the Italian Navy. You've seen these big boats that have oarsmen on the inside rowing. Those are slaves, and they put them bread and water. And if you don't row your oar, you get whipped and killed eventually. And most men who are put into that kind of slavery die at the oar. And so it's a horrible thing. But many Anabaptist men were sent there, and their women and children were sold to be household slaves. So it's still a time when there's a lot of animosity against them. And it's in this world that some of them move east to Prussia, to Danzig, and settle in the Vistula Delta there, and they ask the prince of the area for freedoms. And he promises them military exemption. He dies, and another one dies, and then this king comes along who has the 6-foot cavalry, and he wants their boys. And they suddenly realize he actually seizes all their land, and then the others around him convince him to give it back, and there's this uneasy, but the Mennonites who are living there, they're called Mennonites by now, begin to say, we're not going to have the freedoms we have here. Where could we go? It's in the the middle 1700s by now. And at the same time, in Russia, which is everything to the right of there, or to that side of there, is a large Russian confederation, including what is the modern-day Ukraine. And the Ukraine is these prairies. They're steppes, they're called there, S-T-E-P-P-E-S. These steppes, they're kind of rolling hills, and there's not much happening there except some hunting. And Catherine the Great is the Tsaress of Russia. And she hears about these Mennonite farmers, who are good farmers, and they send a delegation down, and they meet Prince Paul, her son. They meet him, and they ask if they could settle in Russia. And Tsarina the Great, they work out an agreement. A couple of things about the agreement. They're promised military exemption, but they promise not to proselytize, not to evangelize other people. And so a contingent of them, it takes them a year to travel by ox cart from Danzig all the way down to the Ukraine, where they settle. They settle near the Dnieper River that flows through the Ukraine. I should pull a map up. 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, there was the Battle of Mariupol. You remember Mariupol in the news when the Russian and Ukrainian forces are fighting? It's over the very ground they're fighting is where the Mennonites would have settled. And we know them as Russian Mennonites today. They buy large estates of land, 50,000 acres, for instance, and then parcel it out among their people. So it's all owned by the group, and then it's parceled out for farmers. Now that works as long as you don't have too many people. And when it begins to grow, and it does grow, there's a tremendous amount of Russian Mennonites, or Mennonites who move down. The Danzig population essentially begins to die out, and by the 1800s it dies out. So we're talking about the 1700s now in Europe. But they thrive in the Ukraine. And what they do is they take their water principles in reverse. So in Holland and in the Vistula Delta, they take water out of the earth and create fertile soil. In the Ukraine, they figure out how to bring water in using their windmills, bring water in and develop this prairie ground, and they develop winter wheat. And the Ukraine becomes the breadbasket of Europe under these Russian Mennonites. They become very wealthy. By the late 1800s, the Mennonites in Russia control 7% of the agriculture output for all of Russia. That's a massive amount. And we'll kind of wrap up next week with their story. So they're by 1700s, there's a contingent of Mennonites living in the Ukraine, large contingent. Now they're Dutch. So people with names like Friesen, Rempel, Dix. What are other Russian Mennonite names? We only have a few. Kornefriesen in this area. There's only a few, but I'll finish telling you their story a little bit. We'll follow that part of the story through. So in the mid 1800s, they're massively wealthy, and again, once again, the divide between the very wealthy, the people who farm the land, and those who can't have land as families grow and so on, and they start other estates. They buy other large chunks of land. So the two large settlements there are Kartitsa, which is known as the Old Colony, and Mlechna, which is a newer colony. And in the 1800s, as Russia begins to modernize, they find these large chunks of land controlled by these Mennonites, and the Russian government begins to forget the agreement that they had about military exemption and begins to put pressure on them again. And in the 1860s, some of them decide to leave Russia. Also, these people did not speak Russian, and they employed many native Russians to work on their estates, and which led to some problems. These are very wealthy people keeping peasants in poverty. And in the 1860s, Russia says, if you want to be a true Russian citizen, you have to be able to speak Russian. And a group of them leaves and moves to Manitoba. And that first group is known, they're a separatist movement within the Russian Mennonite movement. They're known as the Kleine Gemeinde, the little church. And today there's still that movement. And then a little later in the 1870s, some of them moved to the prairie states of the United States, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, these places. And if you look at maps from prior to this time, that place in the United States is often called the Great American Desert. And when these Russian Mennonites move, they bring their winter wheat with them and their farming practices on this dry land and turn the prairie states into the breadbasket of the world with their turkey red winter wheat. There's a little children's book called Henry's Red Sea that talks about moving to America and what that meant and how they brought the turkey red winter wheat with them. And they literally changed, they took land. The railroads are opening up land in the United States, and they sell this land cheap to these settlers. The railroads are given land by the government to put railroads to the West Coast, so they're given large chunks of land, and that land then, they sell, many of it in the prairie states is sold to the Russian Mennonites. That's why we have them. They are different than us. We are Swiss and German Anabaptists, and they're Dutch Anabaptists. Their language is Plattdeutsch, which is a mix of German and Dutch, like Holland Dutch. For instance, they will not use the term Grumbeere. Kartoffelen is their term for that, which is actually a mix of German and Dutch. So again, they're different, but that's where they come from. Now, at the same time this is happening in the late 1600s, so in 1618 to 1648, there is 30 years of war in Europe. So in the areas that where it says Holy Roman Empire, down to Strasbourg, from Zurich north, all the way to Munster, that stretch of land all the way to Nikolsburg and to the English Channel on this side, there is a 30 years of war that happens between the nobility that is Protestant and the nobility that is Catholic. And they fight for domination of these areas. And it is a devastating war. In some places along the Rhine River, again, near Worms, Strasbourg, Hersfeld, and on up north there, in some of those places, land changes hand 80 times in 30 years. So every time an army fights across this land this way, they take all the crops and all the people. And when they fight across this way, they push them back. And it's just this constant, the armies are almost evenly matched. And so there's this constant turmoil from 1618 to 1648. It culminates in a peace treaty, the Peace of Westphalia, where it is agreed that both religions, both forms of Christianity, it's a terrible thing to say. They've just fought for 30 years, both forms of Christianity, Jesus followers, can live together in peace. It is up to the nobility to decide. Still no freedom, That's up to the nobility to decide. What that does is it devastates that portion of Europe. And it is, in some places, well, in many places, entire villages disappear. There's nothing left to inhabit it. So these armies would fight across. They practiced a scorched earth policy. They'd take all the crops to feed the army, and they'd just simply kill all the people. It's a cruel and hard time in Europe. It leads into famine. And so what the dukes and the lords who now own the land after the 30 Years' War begin to say, we need good farmers. And at the same time that's happening, the authorities in Zurich and Bern, particularly in Switzerland, say we have got to do something to get rid of these Anabaptists. They're going to one final purge. Now, they're not going to kill them because that's not popular anymore. So they banish them. Now, these are good hill farmers. For years now, they've been moving up the slopes of mountains to get away from the authorities. And they farm harder and harder ground. In 2017, when Narita and I were in Switzerland, I went to a little village called Eggiville. Eggwil, Eggiville. And I said, is this the ancestral? I went to the church house. I said, is this the ancestral home of the Miller family? And they said, oh, yeah. You go up the mountain, go up this back road up the mountain, and when you get to a little restaurant, there'll be some old men sitting on the outside drinking beer, and ask them where the Millers live. And so I go up this mountain road, gets narrower and narrower, and there's no guardrails, and Narita's like, I'm looking down this side, and we get to this. Sure enough, there's some old men sitting outside, and so I said, is this the ancestral home of the Millers? And they said, yeah, just go up around that curve, and then there'll be a driveway to the right, and go up that driveway as far as you can, and that's kind of where they began. Now this, I suddenly realized I'm asking them questions about something that happened in the 1600s, and they still remember. Because it's so, and what happened is the Anabaptists are pushed up into the mountains, and they take non-optimal soil and learn how to farm it. And they do that by two things. They learn how to burn limestone down and make lime, and put that in the soil to replenish it, and they learn how to haul manure. Prior to this, many people burned their manure piles. Can you imagine how that would smell? They burned their manure piles because they didn't know it was good. And so these Anabaptists learned how to use that manure and return it to the soil, plow it under, and so on, because they had non-optimal farming. And so as Zurich and Bern pushes them out, now these are people with last names. Their last names are things like the Schwarz von Schrub, the Dreher, the Jero, the Miller, the Hasch von Berg. You recognize these names? Schwarz and Truber, Treuer, Dreher. You know what happens with these last names. These are still historic last names in these places in Switzerland and Germany. What happens with these last names is they come to America, and everyone who comes to America before the Revolutionary War, which most of our ancestors did, come before the Revolutionary War, they have to go through customs. And they're English-speaking customs agents, and these dumb German farmers who cannot speak a word of English, many of them, come in on these ships after horrendous conditions, come in on these ships, and the immigration agent will say, name? Was will er? I will der Name. He wants your name. He said, John Schwarz von Schrub. Immigration agent says, what? John Schwarz von Schrub. And he just spelled it out how he heard it. For instance, Yoder, I found in the ship's list, is spelled 4 different ways. Y-O-D-E-R, J-O-D-E-R, which is the German spelling, and Y-E-T-T-E-R, Yato. The immigration agent just wrote it down how he heard it. Or Dreher. Dreher, the person who lives in the curve, or somebody who turns wood. From one end to Dreher. Treuer. So that's our last name. But as this is happening, as they're being pushed out, they hear about this land, and the nobility in the areas where the 30 Years' War had just raged, which plays an enormous part in this, need good farmers. Their land has been devastated. And so these Swiss Anabaptists make commitments that they will not build church houses, that if they hold church, they will meet in their barns and their houses, and they will not proselytize. They won't go evangelize and try to get other people to come to them, but they move in force up into the Rhine Valley where the war is devastated. And as they settle there, after 1650, they begin to settle there. And these are our people. These are the Rabers and the Millers and the Hirschbergers and the Yoders, the Schwarzentrubers, all our last names. As they settle there, they bring their farming practices with them, and they develop the soil, and it comes back. And this is much better land. It's lush land along the Rhine Valley that gets adequate rainfall, and it's beautiful land. And the soil comes back. Now, they have to pay a special tax because they're Anabaptist, and there's this kind of unease, and they don't own the land. They're not allowed to own the land. Because they can't own the land, the Duke and the Lord and the Earl owns the land, and they're not allowed to own the land, and as they bring this, they're given promises that they can stay on this land. And many of these are in Reformed areas. Not as much Catholic, but Reformed areas. And their neighbors begin to get jealous. And they begin to say, they have special privileges. They don't have to pay tithes when they go to church. They forgot that they had to pay a special tax. And look, God must be prospering their... that's not from God. That must be from the devil and how their farms prosper and ours don't. By the way, there's one other time that this happens in European history. During the plague, Jews did not get the plague at the same rate that Christians did, because they had different cleanliness practices, and Jews lived in ghettos or neighborhoods, Städte, they call them. They're separate areas. And the Christians looked at the Jews not getting plagues and said that they must follow the devil. And they killed them. There are entire Holocausts that happened long before the Holocaust. So these neighbors begin to get jealous, and they're going to go to the authorities, and then the Anabaptists would have to pick up roots and move to another place. And so this cycle of having to move for their faith becomes a part of their story. They moved there first in 1650, roughly, and by 1660, some of them already have to move to other places. And by the 1700s, there's somewhere on the French side of the border near Strasbourg at a little village called Saint-Marie Mines. And it's there, do I have till 10 after, right? So it's there right at 1700 that this new young preacher is ordained. Now, he's dynamic. He's in his early 30s. He can preach. He's fiery. He's beginning to call the Anabaptist movement back to something that they'd lost. He's beginning to say, we need to make sure that we are pure, that we're good. And by this time, the Anabaptist Church, out of reaction to its Protestant, only practicing communion once a year. And communion is a time of reflection. So this young preacher, his name is Jake, says, we should have reflection twice a year. We should check our lives twice a year. And they also do it. The Swiss church, our forefathers, did not practice feet washing. And he said, it's clear in Scripture that we should practice feet washing. And they were wrestling with this problem. The biggest issue is they were wrestling with this problem of what to do with the true-hearted people, Trihatzige, or Halbglaube, half-baptizers, Halbteufel. And these are people who are sympathetic to them, but don't refuse to go the final step of baptism, because if they're baptized, then they have to leave the state church. The Anabaptist Church was very clear that if you choose to join our movement and you choose to be baptized, you can no longer go to the state church. Even if it's to preserve your hide, you can't do it. And so these Halbteufel are becoming a problem. And Jake says, we can't have that kind of half-heartedness in our church. By the way, we're only practicing communion once a year, and it was common for nursing and expecting mothers not to go to church when they're in that state because it's dangerous with illness and so on. And so some women hadn't had communion in 10 years. And so there's all these problems that are beginning to rise. And Jake calls for these reforms. Says, we need to have this happen. Come on. You know how aggressive, not aggressive, but engaged young people can be. And the older bishops, some of them who have suffered horribly in their own lifetime, have had to move numerous times, say, no, wait a minute, let's just take it a little easy, Jake. And this tension develops. And Jake brings it to a head when he calls all the preachers together. But the oldest, the most senior bishop doesn't come. So they send a girl to fetch him, and he says, Ich bin eben komme ab heute runter. I'm not coming, I've got hay down. And the girl comes back and reports to Jake, and it ticks Jake off. And he excommunicates the old bishop right on the spot. Probably a little rash. And he asks, now, who all is on the side of Hans, the old bishop? And 20-some of the other preachers get to their feet, and he excommunicates them on the spot. It's about equally divided. About 25 follow Jake's idea, and the others are excommunicated, and this rift develops. And the rift never really heals. And the movement that Jake leads begins to say, we have to serve Jesus with all our hearts. It's a revival movement within Anabaptism. His name is Jacob Alman. And his followers become known as Alman's Light, and then Almanish, and then Amish. So that's a little different take than we've all heard about the movement, right? Now, Jake was a tailor. Remember, there's all these laws in Europe about what you can wear. And he says, so let's not break the law. Poor people had to wear hooks and eyes. He said, so why change that? That's not something of conscience. So let's keep that, keep those customs. And if we break laws, let's break the laws of conscience. And his followers kept on wearing hooks and eyes and beards below the lips. I read this wonderful account of an Englishman who traveled through the Jura Mountains and found this entire group of people living in the valleys of the Jura Mountains, and all the men had beards, but only below the lips. No mustaches. By the way, mustaches were, this is the Napoleonic era. Mustaches, army officers wore these big. It was really fashionable to wear large mustaches. So let's not do that. Buttons were an issue because only wealthy people could wear buttons, and buttons were very ornate and expensive at the time. Again, I'm not suggesting you wear beards below the lips and hooks and eyes. I'm not suggesting. I'm just telling you how this movement begins and how it evolves. It is a revival movement from within Anabaptism. It happens right at 1700. And there's this tension created, and very quickly the Riestians, those who follow Hans Riest, the other side, identify with the Dutch Mennonites, who are already known as Mennonites. And so the Amish come out of Mennonites, or Anabaptism, in the 1700s. They're not first, and then all the others develop. All right, it's 10:09. We'll take a break. And I'm going to do something, if you're okay with it, I'm going to do something different in the sermon time. I was going to do this kind of a little more, like, what does this mean for us today? But that should wait till the end. I'd like to tell you a story during the sermon time about immigration, if I can, about what it means to come to America. Now, the children won't be in with it, which I wish they, sometime I'll tell the children the story. But we'll pick up immigration, how we came to America, at the sermon time today. Yeah. The Mennonite Brethren. So the Mennonite Brethren developed as a pietist, a revivalist renewal movement within old Mennonites in Europe in the 17 and 1800s. Same with the Brethren. There's all kinds of renewal and revival movements. And by the way, it's easy for us to look and say, boy, we have all these divisions within our church. Every denomination has this kind of differences. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying we're not abnormal. So Mennonite Brethren, the movement in California, Fresno State University, those kinds of places happen out of movements for more religious fervor in the late 17 and into the 1800s. Some Russian and some Dutch and German Mennonites. Nearly all of us have some roots in German. And now we in this group, and I happen to know, I think everyone in this group, from Stolzfußes to Stolz von Fuß, der Fuß von der Himmel. Yoders, Millers, Troyers, all of us are part, and that's why I want to kind of move us into this part of the next part of the movement. When we move from the Rhine Valley, which, by the way, the 30 Years' War, we end up settling, most of our people end up settling from an area from just to the left of the Z in Zurich, north into Strasbourg, up to about Worms, in that area that is now France today, but it's a German-speaking portion of France. And on either side of the Rhine River is where our people would have settled. And that's where they make good Swiss cheese today. They make Rivelsup. They speak hillbilly Dutch, hillbilly German. I told you that story, didn't I? Yeah. I was in a little Mennonite church over there. There's still a little Mennonite church. And by the way, I could give me 1 more minute. The Amish, not all the Amish move to America. Some of them stay in Europe. But the portions who stay in Europe integrate. They never keep the kind of plainness that American Amish did. And so they integrate into the more general Mennonite churches in the late 1800s into the 1900s. Remind me also sometime, maybe the last session, to talk about, for instance, they were great supporters, the Mennonites were great supporters of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. We'll talk about that the last session. Okay, take a break.